Hans Asperger, namesake of Asperger syndrome, and a defendant in this trial, has been accused of knowingly participating in a Nazi killing machine that sought to eradicate disabled people. In his 1944 article titled Die autistischen Psychopathen im Kindesalter, Autistic Psychopathy in Childhood, Asperger described a particularly interesting and highly recognizable type of child. Almost all of the children were described as being severely impaired in social integration, often struggled in school, and had behavioral problems similar to those that autistic people today exhibit. For example, almost all of them had extreme outbursts when angered. However, Asperger saw some potential in some of these children. For example, he saw how Ernst K., one of the children, exhibited independence in thought, experience, and speech. Asperger argues that autistic people are so often particularly original and delightful, and thus can be contributive members of society. However, it is important to note that this only applies to a specific type of autistic person, as not all autistic people are the same. Some of them have traits that society deems desirable, while others have traits that society deems undesirable. As Asperger himself once put it, with the less able children, who are much more disturbed, however, the answers are not so much valuable as deviant. This statement was an extreme red flag because it begins the question, what became of these less able children? After all, Asperger makes it clear that, unfortunately, in the majority of cases, the positive aspects of autism do not outweigh the negative ones. So, what happens to these negative cases of autism? The answer that Herwig Czech and Edith Schaeffer provide is the following. They are sent to Am Spiegelgrund to be put out of their misery. In other words, these kids die. The narrative of Asperger as a principled opponent of National Socialism and a courageous defender of his patients does not hold up in the face of the historical evidence. What emerges is a much more problematic role played by this pioneer of autism research. In 2018, the more controversial aspects of Asperger's career were brought to light by Austrian scholar Herwig Czech. Czech argued that while Hans Asperger may have advocated for some of his patients, he only advocated for those he believed could be molded and educated into becoming productive members of society. However, there were many cases in which autistic children could not be molded and educated into becoming productive members of society. Asperger himself stated that, in the majority cases, the positive aspects of autism do not outweigh the negative ones. While Asperger deemed some of the autistic psychopaths capable of great intellectual achievements, other cases were deemed as bizarre, eccentric, and useless, with fluid transitions towards schizophrenia, whose main characteristics also autism, the loss of contact with the surroundings. Doctors in Nazi Germany, as well as in its occupied territories, believed that those who were hopeless were unworthy of life. Asperger himself was not exempt from this. Schaeffer argues that Asperger's overall judgment of autistic psychopaths was derogatory. Asperger maintained that autistic children had the potential for achievement only as long as they were intellectually intact, and he devoted the majority of his case descriptions to such abled autistic individuals. Schaeffer argues that Asperger drew a sharp line between children with positive versus negative worth. Asperger deemed Fritz and Harrow, to whom he devoted the vast majority of his treatise, to be on the favorable end of the autistic spectrum. When evaluating people like Ernst, who were deemed middle cases, Asperger was unsure as to whether they were particularly abled or mentally retarded. His words, not mine. Asperger concluded that the middle cases were the latter, thus explaining why Asperger came to the conclusion that the positive cases did not outweigh the negatives. With this in mind, we start to see a eugenicist hierarchy of the autism spectrum, where those deemed positive cases were at the top, while those who were deemed middle cases and negative cases were at the bottom. The positives got to see another day. The negatives did not. This is not just evident in Asperger's words, but also in his actions. Hans Asperger sent 13 of his own patients to a euthanasia center known as Am Spiegelgrund, a killing center where a total of 789 people's lives have been claimed due to being deemed unworthy of life. Of the 13 children that Hans Asperger personally sent to Spiegelgrund, 2 of them died. The other 11 children supposedly lived, since it appears that none of their names appeared in Spiegelgrund's Book of the Dead, a catalog that documented the names of the victims in Spiegelgrund. What actually happened to these 11 other children is unknown. They could very well have survived, or they could have died, but records of their deaths were lost. What is definitely known, however, is that these other 2 children did die, for their names were mentioned in the Book of the Dead. These 2 children were Herta Schreiber and Elizabeth Schreiber. Herta Schreiber, aged 2, had suffered from meningitis and diphtheria, and upon being evaluated by Hans Asperger, he concluded that Herta's permanent placement at Spiegelgrund is absolutely necessary. Elizabeth Schreiber, aged 5, was unable to talk and had motor unrest after receiving a head cold in her second year of life. Although Asperger never joined the Nazi Party himself, he was a close colleague with people who oversaw eugenics programs. While it is true that Asperger was the founder of the Vienna Society for Curative Education, it is important to note that his co-founders were Max Gundel, Erwin Jekelius, and Franz Hamburger. Max Gundel was the head of Vienna's public health office and the municipal director of Spiegelgrund. Erwin Jekelius was the medical director of Spiegelgrund. Franz Hamburger was the director of the University of Vienna Children's Hospital and worked behind the scenes to build Vienna's infrastructure of murder. He was also Asperger's mentor figure, who Asperger deeply admired. With this in mind, it is difficult to defend Asperger. In response to the criticisms of Czech and Scheffer, Dean Falk argues that while it is true that Hans Asperger transferred 13 of his patients to Spiegelgrund, and while 2 of them died there, it is likely that Asperger was unaware that he was sending them to their deaths. While it is true that Asperger didn't openly resist Nazi inhumanities, Falk argues that his failure to have done so does not necessarily make him a villain. It would have been counterproductive to speak out explicitly against the Nazi law of forced sterilization. If Asperger did resist, he would not only run the risk of losing his job, but he could have been killed. If that happened, someone else could have taken his place, and that person could have sent even more people to Am Spiegelgrund. So instead of openly resisting the Nazi-dominated medical establishment, Falk argues that Asperger resisted in more subtle ways by trying to influence the establishment to promote humane treatment of disturbed and disabled children, like how Oskar Schindler did with the Jews under his supervision. Taitzer et al. Suggests that while it might be true that 2 out of the 13 children that Asperger referred to Spiegelgrund were killed, it is highly possible that Asperger had no idea that people were being killed there. In the words of Taitzer et al., there was no evidence that Asperger knew about the euthanasia program when he referred to patients who died at Spiegelgrund. Asperger referred the 2 children during June and October 1941 before most of the deaths at Spiegelgrund occurred and before its program became public knowledge.
Objection! Objection!
Objection!
Objection!
Objection!
Objection!
Objection!
Although Falk and Taitzer et al. Both make convincing arguments, it is important to note that their arguments are mainly speculation. It may be true that the public didn't know about the euthanasia program, but it is important to note that Asperger is not among the public. He is not an average doctor. He is a doctor with a high level of agency and is close colleagues with Max Gundel, Erwin Jekelius, and Franz Hamburger, doctors who most certainly did know about the euthanasia program and were in fact active leaders in it. The possibility that Asperger was ignorant of the euthanasia program when taking this into consideration is slim, extremely slim. The language that Asperger uses is very much in line with eugenicist thinking. Asperger had close ties with the higher-ups of Spiegelgrund, so he must have had some degree of knowledge about what was happening behind the scenes. Edith Schaeffer argues that the Spiegelgrund staff said that some parents held explicit conversations about death wishes for their children. When discussing Herta Schreiber, it is important to note that her mother allegedly told Dr. Margaret Hupsch that it would be better if she died. If these were indeed conversations that took place between parents and doctors, this implies that these parents must have had some degree of knowledge about the euthanasia program. Otherwise, they wouldn't explicitly hold death wishes with these doctors, which means that some people among the masses did know about Spiegelgrund's killing center, at least to an extent. If that's the case, and the masses did know about the euthanasia program, given that some of them allegedly expressed death wishes for their children, then the idea that Asperger knew nothing about euthanasia falls flat on its face. With this context, the notion that Asperger knew nothing about Spiegelgrund holds the same level of validity as the idea that most Germans knew nothing about Auschwitz, or the idea that most Austrians knew nothing about Mauthausen. If ignorance is Asperger's best defense, it is an insufficient defense. It doesn't change the fact that he participated in this program, which even Falk and Taitzer et al. Acknowledge. Actions have consequences, and his actions, even if done in ignorance, still took the lives of Herta and Elizabeth. He still played a role in the killing machine of the Nazi regime. The verdict of this paper is that Hans Asperger is, in fact, guilty of knowingly participating in Nazi eugenics. This controversy is mind-opening, and if we are to ensure that history does not repeat itself, we must delve deeper into both the arguments for and against Asperger's involvement. Much of the rhetoric that Autism Speaks uses is borrowed straight from the textbook of the Nazi regime. Autism Speaks can claim to speak for autism all it wants. It most certainly doesn't listen to autistic people. Instead, it perpetuates nonsensical ideas about cures and vaccines causing autism. Autism Speaks has not learned this aspect of the history of autism. It has not learned about Spiegelgrund. Its ignorance has resulted in autism continuing to be treated as a disease. Everyone must learn this history. They must read the works of Ulrich Czech and Edith Schaeffer. We all must learn this history, or risk repeating it. History has a cruel way of repeating itself. The idea that autism is to be cured must be changed. Otherwise, we will run the risk of creating the next Spiegelgrund.